All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to one of our PBSC webinars. If you may have joined us last week for our discussion of the bikeway selection guide. If you did, welcome back to this discussion. We're going to be shifting gears a little bit today from sort of engineering countermeasures to a broader discussion of pedestrians and bicyclists within our statewide planning activities. So we really want to zero in today on the importance of developing specific, comprehensive, tailored action plans for addressing pedestrian and bicyclist safety, especially at the statewide level. I think we're going to have something today for all agencies to benefit from, and if you're from a local agency or a consulting firm or some other group, you'll find a lot here too. But I think particularly for statewide agencies to be thinking about how you can begin to address pedestrian and bicyclist safety concerns at your agency within the statewide level. So we're going to provide a lot of pointers to you, review some guidance that's available on this topic, and then we're actually going to be hearing from two states, Oregon and Virginia. You'll hear stories about how they are using data analysis activities and other steps to develop comprehensive plans and then really implement and get projects on the ground to reverse this trend of pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities and injuries that we've been seeing. So we're delighted that they're here. We're delighted that you're here to share this with us. I have a few bits of housekeeping material to go through right off the bat. So one item is that we are going to be archiving this webinar to our website. You might have already visited pedbikeinfo.org/webinars to find material about this session. The same page that you can find there devoted to this webinar is where we have posted a copy of the slide presentations for you. We will be recording this webinar and posting the recording there as well. So if you miss anything or if you want to share it with someone else, maybe who wasn't able to attend from your office, we will point you there to find all that information. I'm sending the link out now, so that's the URL you can use to find the webinar information. Another important link that you might want to have on hand is to our live transcript. So we are providing a live transcript for this webinar. If you're interested in that, if you're looking for that service, I just posted the link there as well in the chat pod, so you can find that to access the transcript. Email is going to be coming to you later today with information about how to get a certificate of completion for the webinar, how to log professional development hours. The webinar is going to be approved by 1.5 CMs by the American Planning Association, so you'll be able to claim those credits as well. So all of that will be coming to you again later today, about an hour after the webinar is over. Even though you're in a listen-only mode today, I encourage you to send in your comments and your questions along the way. You have a questions pod in your GoToWebinar control panel there. You can submit those questions at any time. I'd encourage you, we're going to ask some questions of you that will hopefully, you can send us links and more information about what you're working on using that same area. We're going to hold the final 30 minutes or so for Q&A. So when we get there, we'll be going through as many of those questions as you've sent in as we can handle in that final 30-minute period before we wrap up the webinar today. So again, send those questions in at any time, and we'll hold them for that discussion period. Let's introduce you to the panelists that we have joining us today. I want to start with Alyssa Gogenauer, who is a transportation safety analyst with VHB with nearly 20 years of experience in conducting road safety audits, safety data analysis, and site design in the public, private, and institutional sectors. She has an emphasis on multimodal mobility and has worked with agencies around the country to provide safe and enjoyable pedestrian and bicycle facilities. Alyssa led the development or the update of the guide that we're going to be talking about today, the Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety Action Plan Guide. So we're excited to have her with us on the panel. I'm Dan Jeline. You typically hear from me as the host of the webinars. I'll be presenting a bit today about the guide itself, the components of a pedestrian safety action plan, and bringing some of the work we do at the Highway Safety Research Center to bear in the discussions today. So I'm delighted to be part of the panel for this session. We're also joined by Christina McDaniel Wilson, who's a registered professional engineer in the state of Oregon and has worked in ODOT's traffic roadway section as the state traffic safety engineer for the past several years. And some of her work includes helping to manage Oregon's All Roads Transportation Safety, or ARTS, program. Prior to this, she was a senior transportation analyst with ODOT's Transportation Planning Analysis Unit, where her work included project analysis and travel demand model application. We're also joined by Nick Foster, who is a multimodal transportation planner working with Kittleson and Associates, focused on walking, biking, and safety projects. His experience includes safety research, comprehensive safety, and active transportation plans, and detailed site investigations and concept designs. Nick serves on the Transportation Research Board's Bicycle Transportation Committee, and he was the project manager for the recent update to Oregon DOT's Bicycle and Pedestrian Safety Implementation Plan. You'll hear from Nick and Christina both about the work that's been done in Oregon to update that plan and really focus on deployment of countermeasure strategies there. We'll then hear from Mark Cole, who is an assistant state traffic engineer with the Virginia Department of Transportation, and he leads VDOT's highway safety programs. For over 2 decades, Mark has held several leadership positions with state and local transportation departments in Virginia and North Carolina, with a focus on planning, design, and construction for transportation projects that serve all modes of transportation. And Mark led the development of Virginia's first pedestrian safety action plan in 2018, and is currently leading the deployment of pedestrian crossing infrastructure at locations identified in the PSAP. So you'll hear part of that story from Mark today about how Virginia approached and Mark's role in that work. But we hope with this panel, we're delighted to have everyone here. We hope that we'll provide some useful information for you on pedestrian and bicyclist safety action plans. I'm going to turn the floor over now to kick off our presentation to Alyssa Guggenauer. I'll jump in at a certain point, and we'll cover a little bit of information about pedestrian and bicycle safety action plans. So Alyssa, why don't you go ahead and kick things off?
Great. Well, thanks everyone. So as Dan said, we're going to talk about the guide and kind of the reasons for developing the plan before we get into those statewide examples. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So the topics for today that Dan and I are going to cover are introducing pedestrian and bicycle safety action plans. So what are they? Also the motivation for developing these plans, because we get questions quite often about, is this something that we should consider developing? So looking at why you might want to develop one. The guidance for developing pedestrian and bicycle safety action plans, and the components of a high quality pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan. All right, so next slide. Okay, so you can go ahead and hit next there, Dan. So, thinking about the reasons for developing a pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan and what exactly is included in that is that these are plans to help agencies to directly address pedestrian and bicycle safety. So the plan provides an opportunity for communities to state their vision for improving safety and to use a data-driven approach to identify actions to mitigate those demonstrated safety concerns. You might be saying, we have some other plans that already kind of do this, whether it's on a statewide scale as far as a strategic highway safety plan, or for local agencies thinking about a Vision Zero plan. And we'll talk a little bit later about how this is different from those and how they kind of work together. So next slide. All right, so thinking again about, is this something that's worthwhile for your agency? What we know is that nationally, pedestrian and bicycle fatalities have been on the rise. Since 2009, there's been a 51% increase in pedestrian fatalities and a 35% increase in bicycle fatalities. This trend is reflective of that for many state and local agencies throughout the country. So in order for all of us to achieve our goals of reducing fatalities and serious injuries on our roadways, we really do need to take a critical look at the distinct safety needs of pedestrians and bicyclists. Next slide. So, thinking now about why to develop the pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan. Whenever you're developing these plans, it really helps to understand or helps you to better understand how different roadway users are interacting on your own roadways. We can certainly look at national trends, but every agency is distinct. There's different regional variations in the way roadways are designed or the types of ways that people use them. So this really allows you to take a look at it and say, what does this mean based on the data that I have for my agency? Overall, this also improves conditions for walking and bicycling. And, we know that car ownership is quite expensive. And so when we think about, helping people to be able to get to the critical needs every day as far as, being able to go to the grocery store or to their place of work, is that we need to make sure that people have a safe and affordable way to do that. And all of us really at some point in our day are pedestrians. So this really does impact everybody. All right. So thinking about the statewide plan specifically, I think before, many agencies were thinking that this was much more targeted to local agencies. But, through the years, more and more states have been developing their own pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan. And so these plans provide a framework for the entire state's approach to improving safety. So, building off of those statewide strategic highway safety plans is that this allows the state to take that a little bit further and look in a more granular detail at pedestrian and bicycle data and creating very distinct actions to improving safety. It also provides the opportunity to reflect and elevate the safety concerns that are demonstrated at the local level. So what you might hear from certain agencies is that they've got some particular struggles, and sort of the statewide plan allows the state to come up with a framework that benefits not just safety on state roads, but also on local roads as well. These plans can also support local agencies, MPOs, and others that are working to improve safety. So, some local agencies might be really well equipped to analyze their own data and to, maybe create their own plan. But there's many local agencies that don't have that type of capacity or bandwidth to do that. And so, being able to create these plans really provides a framework for them as well to identify, okay, these are different types of actions I can take. These are the types of locations where I want to make improvements. So it really helps those agencies as well. And it provides this direct connection between safety funding and projects supporting vulnerable road users. So think of it as a way to really come up with a formal plan for, how your safety dollars are going to be spent. All right, next slide. So I just wanted to touch on kind of two broader questions that we get quite often about developing these plans before we get into the details of the plans themselves. So one of the big questions is, do I create a combined plan or a separate plan? And really, there's a variety of factors that would help you to make that determination. One, there's no wrong answer or right answer to this. You can certainly do it together or separate. But partially, it might come down to available resources. Certainly, you need to have a bit more available resources at the time if you're going to do both plans together. But you can also have a cost savings in that sense, in that you've got a set of stakeholders together, you're already performing a data analysis, so you kind of can have some cost sharing if you do it at the same time. This also allows for coordination with existing documents and plans, so that might help you to really understand, should we do something together or separate? You might, really have a state emphasis that is very specifically on pedestrian safety, and so because of that, it might make sense to only have a pedestrian safety action plan. And similarly, that really aligns with the agency's goals, is that, where do you all want to head as an agency? Are both of them just equally important at this time, or is there one that you want to start with first? So no wrong way to do it. Certainly there's examples of both combined and separate. So next slide. This is the other question that we get quite frequently, is that how do pedestrian and bicycle safety action plans relate to other types of plans? Because, oftentimes the agencies will say, well, I already have these other types of plans in place. So does that mean that I don't need to create a pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan? Or how does that fit in with the other things that we have in place? So go ahead and hit next, Dan. So some of the different types of plans that you all might see or that you have in place are, as I had mentioned before, on the statewide level, looking at strategic highway safety plans. Your agency might have trails, parks, or greenway plans, broader transportation plans. You might have a pedestrian or bicycle master plan. I'd also mentioned, for local agencies in particular, that you might have Vision Zero plans. And so, the question is that if I have some of these other plans in place, how does this pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan fit in with it, or how is it different from these plans? And I'll start with talking about how it's a little bit different, is that pedestrian and bicycle safety action plans are very focused, as the name implies, on pedestrians and bicyclists very specifically, but on safety. That's the real key here, is that, some of these other plans, thinking about transportation plans or master plans, that those have different goals in mind. And so what you might find is that if you're developing a transportation plan, or say a pedestrian or bicycle master plan, is that you could have the safety action plan be a component of that, have safety be a separate but very strong component to it. And, or if you don't have one of those plans in place, this pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan can be a separate component. And interestingly, when we think about safety for pedestrians and bicyclists, some of that means making sure that we have a connected and comfortable network that is enjoyable for people to use, so that they actually, want to get out there and walk and bike. And so, there might be some elements of that do feel very reminiscent of maybe more of a master plan. But, it is very related to safety, and that's the key for these types of plans, is that they do all tie back to safety. For agencies that have a Vision Zero plan, sometimes, or if your agency is considering that, but also considering a bicycle and pedestrian safety action plan and trying to weigh sort of how to do that, which one should come first, is that for Vision Zero, that is a type of a safety plan. And sometimes the Vision Zero plans can be quite daunting to create. Initially, there's a lot of coordination that is going on with those. And so sometimes it's a little bit more manageable to start with a mode-specific pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan that then eventually gets folded into the Vision Zero plan. Or as part of your Vision Zero plan, you might determine that, understanding that pedestrians and bicyclists are at a greater risk for fatality and serious injury, that, you need to create some specific actions for those. And so the pedestrian bicycle safety action plan is kind of woven into that Vision Zero plan ultimately. So, there's a lot of different elements or different types of plans that are out there, and it really depends on what your agency needs are. I would just stress that, looking at, especially for states, that the strategic highway safety plan, many states have pedestrians in particular, and some with pedestrians and bicyclists as an emphasis area. And the question is that what are you doing then to improve safety and to reduce fatalities and serious injuries for those road users? And that is really where the pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan comes into play, is that it helps you come up with a data-driven way of specific actions to improve safety for those road users. So with that, we wanted to get a better sense from you all about the types of plans that your agency currently has, and you can go ahead and check all that apply.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. We've got the poll up now. Hopefully you all can see it. Let me read through the options, though, if anyone's not seeing the screen or is away from their desk. We want to know which of these plans that we have listed here does your agency currently have. So there's the Strategic Highway Safety Plan. You may have a Vision Zero or a Towards Zero Deaths plan. A local road safety plan. A lot of states are developing those. Alyssa talked briefly about some local roads issues. Trails plans often are pretty common and may be another side of a general ped bike master plan or a ped bike plan that may be statewide. That's our final option. We were limited in our options here. So one thing I wanted to ask, if you've got something else that you're super proud of, send it into the questions pod, like a link to it even. I'd like to see maybe some plans that are beyond these 5. But again, those are the options here. I want to leave the poll open for maybe 10 more seconds because I see people are still voting. Once it's closed, I'll show you the results. We'll kind of see what the audience today has in terms of the plans they have on the books. So again, pick as many of these as apply to you. We've really geared them toward, as we have with this webinar, a state agency representation, but I think a lot of local agencies, you likely have a lot of these same plans. Counties may have these plans as well. I'm going to give it a few more seconds and then I'm going to close. Thank you all for voting and sharing your perspectives with us. I'm going to close it now and then I'll share the results. So let's take a look. Alyssa, I'm not sure if you can see these, but it seems like the most common plan the audience has right now is the general, that ped bike master plan, which is really great. A whole dedicated plan to bicycling and walking is really impressive. It may impact safety or include some safety measures, it may not. The strategic highway safety plan is very common. We have a lot of states out there, and we've all got those. The Towards Zero Deaths plan or Vision Zero plans are becoming more common, it looks like. Those elimination goals to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries. So you likely have a plan on those. About a third of you do. Another third have trails plans. And then less common, about a quarter, the local road safety plans. And likely others. And I'll review the chat pod and the questions to see what's coming in. But those are the results, Alyssa.
Yeah, well, great. I mean, I think that what's really positive is that quite a few of you are already, have a variety of types of safety plans in particular in place. And so, that's kind of a big first step, is just really understanding your own data to help you determine where to take action to improve pedestrian and bicycle safety. So we can go ahead to the next slide here. So now that we've talked a bit about kind of the bigger picture with, maybe why you might want to create a pedestrian and bicycle safety action plan, we want to talk about this guidance document that we had created here and is published on Federal Highway's website that really lays out that process for developing pedestrian and bicycle safety action plans. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to go through some of the specific steps to develop these plans.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. And we put a link to this guidebook in the chat. I'll send it around again later. So you can get a lot more detail on some of these steps by reviewing that guide. There's just so much information. We don't want to read the guide to you. So we're not going to do that today. We hope that you'll have an opportunity to review it. But I did want to talk through briefly each of these main steps that you'll probably, in some capacity, you'll be involved in conducting these when you do your own plans. And the outset, with any good plan, you're going to talk about your vision, your goals and objectives for pedestrian and bicyclist safety. This really is going to drive the entire data analysis, stakeholder input, recommendations, and how you track moving forward, especially the tracking. You're going to be looking at how you move toward your goals and how you achieve them. So setting them at the outset is really important. You want to keep the plan focused, and that your goals, really having clear spelled out goals, will help you do that. We talked earlier about Vision Zero and Towards Zero Deaths plans. Maybe that's your goal. You want that on paper. We are going to eliminate deaths and serious injuries among pedestrians and bicyclists, and then you work toward those goals. Whatever your stated goals are, it takes time to work with your stakeholders, your task forces, those who are involved in the planning process, to figure out what those are. It's not a quick process. It could take you quite some time having those internal deliberations, but it can keep the plan focused if you have these clear goals and objectives. It'll identify for you what are those metrics for success that we want to see. What are the measures we're going to track? If you haven't fully convened your partner group yet, this process is going to get you there, because you're going to begin to reach out to anyone who has any overlap or any work that's influencing or impacting pedestrian and bicyclist safety. You'll find new partners in your planning process through this step. And I think it'll help you not only identify those partners, but ensure that they are involved throughout the planning and implementation process, so you can keep them engaged as you move toward implementation. So it's a critical first step of the planning process. The analysis of safety data, I'd say when we talk about developing plans, this is the one that most agencies really want to dive into, especially those of you who are in the trenches in data analysis and putting projects on the ground and planning. You want to know, how can I get use the best method for identifying where my investments are going to have the biggest bang for the buck, say, or where they're most needed, because you can't do a project in every location right off the bat, at least. So the struggle for most agencies, at least now, and we're kind of moving in this direction of proactive systemic safety improvement. So if you look at the spectrum of the types of projects we can be doing and the types of analysis that might lead us there, we've traditionally done those spot safety projects where we find where the most deaths or the most injuries have taken place, and we fix those. And that's a very important step, but it's reactive to what's happened in the past, not proactive and predictive, and looking what those future risks might be, where those crashes may happen, those deaths and injuries may happen in the future. So as you move down this spectrum, you can branch out from just those spots to looking at fixing entire corridors, and your data analysis process can help you identify not only spots, but corridors that need attention. And then you move toward, well, if we know what's dangerous at one place, what's proven to be resulting in death and fatality in the past, or injury in the past, what other sites share those characteristics? Can we be predictive in the way we're deploying countermeasures? Can we look at other sites that may share risk factors? And that's what we mean in this analysis phase of looking at predictive safety and trying to predict and make proactive improvements. And so within our guide, this is just an example of one of the tables we included, but there's entire tables of, we're talking about more than just tapping into police reported crash data. That's important, but there are so many other data types. You talk about behavioral and observational data, exposure data, health data sources that really need to be part of your pedestrian and bicyclist safety action plan. So the guide is going to point you to some data sources that you're familiar with, a lot that you may not be familiar with, and your partners are a critical part of that as well. We could talk about that in just a bit. Another critical input phase is going to be stakeholder involvement, stakeholder engagement. How do you, as a state, plan to reach out to all the different stakeholders that need to be heard and need to have a voice in the planning process? For a city, it's hard enough, or for a local agency, it can be hard enough. For an entire state to represent all the area types, all the context that you have, can be very daunting. And so you want to really think through the types of organizations, the types of stakeholders that you include. And this includes both external to you. You might have advocacy organizations. You might have organizations working toward working on equity issues, diversity, inclusion. You want to be thinking about underrepresented groups, populations, accessibility organizations. But you also want to be thinking about within your own agency, we need to be doing outreach to other branches and business units and departments. Not everyone is on the same page with pedestrian and bicyclist safety, so it's looking inward as well as outward. I would say also many of you represent local agencies. Your local agencies are some of the biggest partners and stakeholders in what ends up in your statewide plan, because there's overlap, there's shared jurisdictions, there are roadways that intersect that you and the local agencies need to be prepared to solve, and having them involved in that process is critical. Be thinking through this whole process, no matter the tools that you're using for engagement, when you're conducting meetings, how you're structuring those, who is included and who might be excluded, who may not have a voice, doesn't know necessarily that you're putting this plan together, that you need to reach out to and make an effort and really get them involved. So the stakeholder input, I think what you'll find with this phase, it's more qualitative, yes, than data analysis, but it provides just as useful of an input for what you weave into your plan. When you get to this, the heart of the plan, this step where you're identifying the safety improvements and making recommendations for what you want to do, this is bigger than just a list of countermeasures that you might deploy. Yes, that's important. These engineering countermeasures, we hear a lot about step action plans. Some of you wrote in about those, that you're pursuing those. You've got your uncontrolled crossing countermeasures figured out and a process for doing that, which is excellent. But think about broader than just engineering. We have policy interventions that can help us address issues like speed, say, or even internal agency policies about the requirement to review and consider pedestrian and bicyclists in all projects. These are important policies that you can set up in your pedestrian safety action plan and bicyclist safety action plan that can really make gains down the road. And then we can't be forgetting about behavioral interventions as well, these programs that really supplement what we do on the ground, no matter what that looks like in your community. You want to get behavioral safety organizations engaged in that process, and how can we supplement what we're putting on the ground with how people perceive that and need that information, working through media to get the word out about these things. This is all very important, and it can all be woven together in your recommendations of your action plan. This is maybe the most important step, is when you create a plan, you want it to be implemented. You want it to have results. So set yourself up for that success when you develop your plan. You may have examples of plans you've developed in the past that may be just sitting there that aren't being implemented. And you can learn from those experiences. Why weren't they implemented? Did they not have funding behind them? Did they not have assignments and responsible agencies for completing these steps? How often, think about this, how often you want to support or report your progress and review what's been done. Have we moved toward these interim milestones that we've set, or do we need to review those and take a step back and think about what we could be doing differently? I think it's important too to consider not only resources that you might need to put projects on the ground, but what within your agency might you need? Do you need to restructure where safety is in your departments? Do you need more staff capacity to do this work? I think you probably will if you're making lots of these recommendations. So this is all very important in this initial phase, and I think it's an important. This step may be missing, I think, from a lot of plans, or at least really clear implementation steps, and evaluation tracking steps. It can be very important. We wanted to leave you all with, and I'll ask Alyssa to jump in here too if she has any other recommendations, just thoughts about considerations that you might need to be keeping in mind as you approach these steps. We've talked a lot about some of these. You know, the third one down, what data can you use in your analysis? Not just the data you have, but think about your partners in the health departments and others. You'll hear some examples from our case studies today about how they brought data to bear from other groups that may not have been included traditionally in pedestrian decision making.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alyssa.
Dan,
Yeah.
I would just add on to that a little bit is that thinking about the type of agency, you know, what is available to you, and maybe don't hesitate to reach out to other partners. So if you're a local agency, reaching out to, you know, your neighboring, if you're part of an MPO, or reaching out to the state to see if they have data that you might be able to use. And similarly for the state is that, you know, I think there's some really great local data sets that sometimes, you know, and unfortunately aren't always available at the statewide scale. And so if there's data that you don't have available that would help you in better understanding pedestrian and bicycle safety issues, then, you know, I would add that to your wish list. And maybe that's something that can be incorporated as part of an action in your plan, is to develop those data sets in the future.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The fourth bullet down, I think there might be a longer list of stakeholders and partners you want to engage in your process, in your planning process, at least longer than you think. The more you think about this, the more you can involve all different types of groups and organizations. The question is, how do you involve them? I think not only who you're involving, but how do they need to be reached and involved? And I think that stakeholder involvement phase is one that a lot of agencies really struggle with. And then I think on the final one, that these emerging and future challenges, you could think about maybe 10 years ago, if you developed a ped bike safety action plan then, who thought to include e-scooters and e-bikes and all sorts of emerging technologies, and maybe even sidewalk delivery robots that may be taking up our pedestrian and bicyclist space too in the future. All of these emerging challenges that we're thinking through, AVs, wrap that into your plan. If you're starting now, this is your chance to really capture, who do we envision this plan, this user group to be? How do we provide for those who need access to this space and to be protected? I think this is a great time to be thinking through some of these future challenges that may be coming down the line. So I'm gonna, I think, shift now to our next presentations. Alyssa and I, you know, we shared some information, but I think it's really valuable to hear it from those who have actually done the work. So we're gonna stop talking after we do just one more poll. You talked about some of the plans, you shared information about some of the plans you have earlier. This one's more specific to pedestrian and bicyclist safety action plans. What's your current status with respect to these plans specifically? Are you considering developing a ped bike safety action plan? Maybe you are currently developing a ped bike safety action plan, or you've adopted a ped bike safety action plan. You may not be interested in developing one of these. You can say that too, that's another option, or you may not be sure. We're trying to force you to one response here, just so we get a read on how common these are. I think that it's important to also consider as you're thinking through this, you may have other plans that you can weave a strong safety component into. You use these same types of steps to make sure that you're hitting safety from all angles in your plan. It doesn't have to be called necessarily a ped bike safety action plan. You can accomplish some of these things elsewhere, but we're just curious about how prevalent these plans might be. I'm gonna wait a couple more seconds and then I will close the poll and show you the results. All right, let's close it. Thanks for voting. I'm sorry if you didn't have a chance already. We have almost half of you aren't sure what your approach is gonna be with ped bike safety action plans. I think that's kind of encouraging because you're here and you're hearing some examples and some inspiration. So I think that's good. Very few of you say you're not interested in developing one of these. I think that's also good. And a lot of you are either considering it now or you're currently developing one. Some of you even haven't adopted one. 13% haven't adopted ped bike safety action plan. If you have one, if you wouldn't mind at some point in this webinar to send the link into the questions pod, we'd love to create and compile a full library of where these plans are. We know some examples, and you'll hear about those today, but I think having more on hand will be really useful. So again, I'm going to close this poll. What we're going to do now is move toward our next, our first case study presentation from Oregon. Let's see, Nick, I'm going to hand you the screen, and I'll let you know when we see it. We're going to hear from both Nick Foster from Kittleson and Associates and Christy McDaniel Wilson with Oregon DOT. And Nick, you may need to swap the under display settings, swap the views. Yeah, you were almost there. Great, perfect. And we're all ready to go. Christy, whenever you're ready. Oh, it looks like you're still on mute, Christy. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay now?
I can, yes, thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for the opportunity to share an update on Oregon's Pedestrian, Bicycle, and Safety Implementation Plan. I'll be co-presenting today with Nick Foster from Kittleson Associates. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview, so we'll talk a little bit about the background, the NCHRP report, some project goals and objectives, differences between our old plan and then the update, and then a little bit about implementation. Next slide, please. I'll start off with a little crash history. In Oregon, much like the nation, pedestrian and bicycle crashes are on the rise. We're mainly seeing this increase in urban areas and typically at intersections on multi-lane arterials. Next slide, please. Here's a few more graphs that show the different trends between the crashes involving pedestrian and bicyclists between 2009 and 2018. I just want to make sure that it's clear this is Oregon-specific data. What we're seeing is that for bicycles, the increase is not as high as for pedestrians. That's really been on the rise over the last 10 years. Next slide, please. In Oregon, we have the All Roads Transportation Safety Program, or ARTS. This is a data-driven, application-based, statewide competitive safety program. Through ARTS, we take our safety funding and then we allocate it to the regions based on the distribution of fatal and serious injury crashes. And then within each region, the jurisdictions compete for safety funding by submitting applications under one of 4 of our application types. Next slide, please. So our systemic safety plans, they're pretty important because they're one of the tools that jurisdictions use to screen for project selection through the ARTS program. We have 3 statewide systemic safety improvement programs, or plans, that focus on infrastructure. These plans capture about 80% of our fatal and serious injury crashes statewide, and they align with the TSAP, or Transportation Safety Action Plan, emphasis areas. Rotary departure and intersection were developed using traditional systemic safety analysis. So we go through a screening process, identify locations with frequent and severe crash history, and then make recommendations for low-cost proven safety countermeasures at those locations. But for systemic screening for ped and bike, it's a bit different. We find that the traditional method is not really effective, and the biggest reason is that for us, the frequency of these crashes at one location is rarely enough to establish a clear understanding of the crash causes and trends. So that makes identifying an effective countermeasure somewhat subjective. So for ped and bike, we definitely want to apply more of a risk-based approach that's data-driven, and that helps us prioritize locations based on risk factors. This way, we're capturing locations with a crash history and then also locations with a high crash risk. As it was mentioned early on, in Oregon, we can't afford to do a project at every location, so we want to make sure that the locations that we're prioritizing are the best locations. We were fortunate to have a panel member from Oregon on the NCHRP 893 project. So after the report was published, we applied for and we were granted or awarded, a grant to develop a systemic ped and bike plan. And through this grant, we partnered with Kittleson and DKS to conduct the work. So I'll turn it over now to Nick to talk a little bit more about how the plan was developed.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. So as she mentioned, this project was a little unique in that it was funded through an NCHRP implementation project. So if you are a state DOT who's interested in implementing innovative research, there is a program there now for that. So just a quick plug for that. But NCHRP Research Report 893, it describes a systemic safety analysis method for pedestrian safety analysis, which Dan covered some of that a little bit earlier in his part of the presentation. But again, the goal of this is to prevent crashes before they occur. It's based more on crash probability than it is history at a specific location. It also helps you to look at cost-effective countermeasures and how to prioritize locations for treatment. The idea behind this approach is that while the locations where some of these crashes may occur may seem random, the contributing factors to them are predictable, and so the crashes are preventable. So we followed the approach in this report for pedestrians, as well as we adapted it to bicyclists. Very similar approaches. Overall, the report identifies a 7-step process. There's lots of benefits to this type of approach. I won't walk through these all in a lot of detail since Dan covered some of them already. But again, the systemic approach is a great way to approach things for crashes where they're spread across the network, like severe crashes or pedestrian and bicycle crashes. And so you may not see them consistently occurring at the same location year after year. So this type of approach is really great for getting out and getting ahead of those crashes. So the first step in the process is to define your study scope. For the Oregon DOT plan, this was a statewide study area focused on state highways. We did emphasize urban areas using the FHWA population over 5,000 people definition, though we did also still look at rural areas. Much of Oregon is rural geographically. It was important we also consider those areas too. And then since this was a pedestrian and bicycle safety plan, our target crash types were pedestrian and bicycle crashes. We had some successes in this part of the project by using crash data trees and other things like that to help us hone in on just where the crashes were occurring the most, to help us make our case for, say, prioritizing urban areas using data behind that. The second step is to compile data. We looked at 4 general categories of data: road data, land use and demographic data, crash data, and then we looked for exposure or count data. This is often, I think, a challenging part for a lot of agencies, especially for pedestrian and bicycle safety plans, where maybe they don't have a complete inventory of everything. There are ways to work around that to some extent. We were fortunate that on the ODOT, on the state system, we had quite a bit of data. There was, but unfortunately, there was limited data for the non-state roadways. We were focused more on the state roadways. We did try to look at some of the non-state roadways to help inform our analysis, but the extent to which we were able to do that was a little more limited because of the data. Then the third step is to determine what are your risk factors for crashes. So we did this for both pedestrian and bicycle crashes separately. This table here presents the pedestrian risk factors. We identified the risk factors primarily from looking at crash data and seeing what types of features were generally overrepresented with crashes. Other ways to do that can include, more quantitative safety performance function type analysis using crash prediction models, if you have the data for that. We didn't quite have enough exposure data to do that for this project. Or if you're lacking some data or light on data, you can also look to what other people have already learned from research, either national research from crash modification factors or other states or other agencies' safety plans. What have they seen in their data? There's a fair chance that there's quite a bit of overlap with what's going on in your jurisdiction too. So we did use a combination of data analysis here, but we also did back that up in cases with research findings too. We did come up with some different factors among the urban and rural areas. Some of that was due to just the smaller sample sizes, and some of it was due to different data in the areas. And so these factors can now be used for either screening or site analysis. This table here presents our bicycle crashes risk factors. They're, again, developed in a similar process. there is a fair amount of overlap between the pedestrian and bicycle risk factors. However, we did find some differences in them. For instance, access density seemed to have a larger role in predicting the potential for a bicycle crash than it did for, say, a pedestrian crash. That was one interesting finding. But otherwise, yeah, quite a bit of overlap between the two. The next step then is to take those risk factors and identify potential treatment sites. There's a few different ways you can do this. We ended up weighting the different risk factors based on their correlation with crash severity. So we wanted to prioritize those risk factors that were most correlated with higher crash, higher severity incidences. So we completed a GIS-based analysis using ODOT's data to screen the entire statewide network for potential high crash corridors. And then we looked for general pockets of where we were seeing higher crash areas pop up, or not higher risk areas pop up. And we made sort of logical segments out of those that for potential treatments. Once you've identified your sites for treatment, the next step is to select potential countermeasures. So here I am highlighting the first couple bullets there. That's how far we went with this ODOT project. We established an overall selection framework for selecting countermeasures, looking at how effective would the countermeasure potentially be at treating the identified risk factors. So are they directly related to the identified risk factors? Is there an available crash modification factor we can use to assess how effective they are? We also looked at whether or not, a framework would also include looking at whether or not the countermeasure is related to existing ODOT funding programs or the crash type. The cost of the countermeasure would obviously be another consideration. Oftentimes the goal of these is to deploy at as many locations as possible. So lower cost countermeasures are oftentimes the goal. And then also just considering overall the feasibility of the countermeasure at a given location. And then from there, we whittled things down to potential countermeasures list. We did this at an example set of 50 sites for ODOT, just showing how this first level screening would look. The next step would then be to do a more detailed countermeasure selection process, which we didn't quite get to in this project, but will be done later on, as Christy will talk about later through their All Roads Transportation Safety Program. One of the things that was helpful for this step with ODOT is they had a pre-approved countermeasure list already prepared. And so that gave us a good menu of options with ODOT approved crash modification factors or crash reduction factors in the case of ODOT, and information about them and improved cost estimates and things like that. The information is available to the local agencies too in Oregon, giving them a jump start on that process. With that list of countermeasures, they also have a very good and flexible approach for adding countermeasures into it. We were able to add in several through this process, just as research had come out since the last time they had updated the list, and ODOT was definitely hungry to add new ones to it using the best available knowledge, or working with us to using the best information out there to identify and assess the potential effectiveness of different countermeasures. And so we really had a good list of options in the end to choose from. Let's see. One challenge I think we run into with the systemic approach, particularly for bicycle crashes, that's worth just being aware of as you step into this, is that sometimes it may require a more intensive project than would be funded through a typical systemic program that's only focused on low-cost countermeasures. The step you may need to take may be something more like a separated bike lane, for instance, or adding sidewalks in. And those projects can be a little more intensive than what we typically think of when we think of low-cost systemic treatment. It's not a bad thing. It's just something to consider and to prepare funding programs for. So you can also address those locations that need a little more attention than just improved crossings or other treatments like that. All right, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Christy.
Thanks, Nick. So I'll talk a little bit about how this new plan is different So our older plan was developed in 2014. It was a data-informed approach, but not as data-driven as we would have liked. It did target reducing fatal and serious injuries and increasing our understanding of ped and bike crashes, but it provided a separate toolbox of low to cost medium countermeasures, but didn't really match those up to countermeasures or locations. So it was kind of tricky for local jurisdictions and for the state to apply that. I think with this new plan, we're getting more of a methodology, definitely not a static project list that's transferable to other locations. And you have the flexibility to update this methodology with more current crash data. We were also able to explore demographics, fine-tune our risk factors, and our weighting criteria. I think one of the biggest benefits is that this framework helps identify countermeasures that tie risk to specific treatments. So as Matt showed in that previous slide, it helps you line up the countermeasures with crash characteristics for that specific location and gives you the opportunity to look at several different countermeasures and prioritize the best ones. Next slide, please. A few other considerations, transferability, and some others. So data availability and consistency is critical. You know, not every agency has the same data set. I think some agencies may find that they need to enhance their data sets to conduct similar analysis. We have pretty robust data sets for crash, but not always the case for our inventories of assets and geometric features. We did find that we used a lot of existing research to fill in data gaps, and we did talk a little bit about exposure models and data and how that could help enhance our analysis. We looked at an exposure model from a neighboring state, but found that it really wasn't a good fit. It was generally able to predict the highest count locations, but there was a lot of variation when comparing count estimates to actual counts. So I think for us, that might be a next step where we take a closer look at developing something more specific to Oregon. Unfortunately, we don't have a separate database for ped and bicycle count data. We are in the process of getting a new count data system, so we will have that flexibility moving forward. So I'm hopeful that that's a data set that we can tap into later on. I think we also found that we didn't have complete data sets for all of the risk factors that we wanted to evaluate, and that some of the data sets that we had were older than others. So syncing data sets really helps improve the analysis efficiency. For example, our crash data is always a couple of years behind. So right now, I think with this plan, we used up through 2017 data, and we're just now getting a more current data set, 2019. So I think that making sure that whatever data sets you're looking at are comparable is pretty important. Next slide, please. So follow-up and next steps. We would like to apply the results statewide. As Nick mentioned, this focus was mostly on state highways. So we would like to see some more application at the local level. We've just rolled this plan out in the last couple of months. We really haven't had any feedback from the local jurisdictions to know how they're using this plan or if they've had a chance to investigate it. One thing I suspect is that we may hear that there's a little bit of a challenge on the local jurisdiction side and maybe setting up this framework and identifying all of their data. But again, we haven't really had a chance to gather any feedback yet, so I'm just anticipating that might be a comment. The intersection analysis also that was conducted for this was limited by available data. Right now, even on state highways, we don't have an inventory of unsignalized intersections, only signalized intersections. So we still have some work that we need to do to make sure that our data sets are robust and full. And then we, as I mentioned earlier, considering or thinking about our approaches to estimating exposure and maybe looking at Oregon data specifically to identify a process for that. And then continuing to understand or expand our understanding of safety treatments and effects. So next slide, please. So I'll pause here for quick questions, but I'll quickly go ahead and have Nick jump to the next slide. which has some links to our plan, and then there's some contact information on the very last slide. So this has a link to our arts program, which has all of the systemic plans listed in this link as well. There's the NCHRP 893 plan, our ped and bicycle plan, and then our transportation safety action plan. So I will say thank you and turn it back over to Dan.
Thank you both so much. Appreciate learning about that. We're going to keep those questions coming in for the time at the end of the webinar, but what I want to do is move forward and switch it over to Mark Cole to tell the Virginia story before we loop back together for the Q&A. So Mark, take a look at the screen. I'll let you know when we've got your slides up. If you swap those views, yeah, awesome.
All right, great. Thanks, Dan. It's great to be with everybody this afternoon to share Virginia's story in regards to pedestrian safety and our pedestrian safety action plan. I always like to start with the big picture of where our safety trends are in Virginia. And you can see here that over the last 20 years or so, we've had quite a roller coaster in regards to our deaths and serious injuries. Our deaths, after reaching an all-time low since we've been reporting back in 2014, have been increasing. And as of 2019, we saw 827 traffic deaths in Virginia. And at the same time, our serious injuries have been reducing. Since 2005, we've reduced from around 22,000 serious injuries to just over 7,000 serious injuries, with both of those numbers being way more than what we find acceptable. And as we look in more detail, our types of travelers in the state who are involved in traffic crashes that result in death, now over 1 in 4 of our traffic deaths in Virginia is a vulnerable road user, which we define as a bicyclist, a pedestrian, or a motorcyclist. And in addition, beginning in 2016, for the first time, we saw that our vulnerable road users made up more deaths than our total intersection crashes. So now vulnerable users are the second leading type of death in Virginia behind road departure deaths. And a lot of that increase of our vulnerable road user deaths in Virginia has been driven by pedestrians. If you look at our increases since we saw that low in 2014 of our total traffic deaths, a third of our increases since 2014 have been our pedestrian deaths. So we saw over a 50% jump in 2016, and unfortunately those numbers have stayed at a very high level since that time. So we've been doing a lot of work in the state to try to understand what's going on in the area of pedestrian safety and do everything we can to help the situation. So today I'm going to talk briefly about our pedestrian crash assessment. I'm going to talk some about something we call the Virginia Health Opportunity Index. I'm going to give you an overview of our pedestrian safety action plan, and I'm going to share some tips for using data to examine traffic safety issues. One of the first things we did back in 2016 is to take an in-depth look at our pedestrian crashes in Virginia. So we looked at several years of our pedestrian crash data. We added other data elements that aren't in the crash reports, but we had available to us, such as road design information, or we also used Google Street View information so that we could learn more about the environment where our pedestrian crashes are happening in the state. And we learned a lot that we could then use to do other activities to improve pedestrian safety. 5 big things we learned from the crash assessment. First, over 90% of our pedestrian deaths occur while the pedestrian is trying to cross the street. However, we also learned that most of the time we don't have crossing infrastructure in place where pedestrians need to cross. Second, land use matters. If there are pedestrian generating land uses, there will always be a need to cross the road. Third, speed can be deadly, and the chance of death increases as the posted speed limit increases and the travel speed increases, especially for vulnerable road users like pedestrians. Number 4, visibility is crucial. 77% of our pedestrian deaths in Virginia occur in limited light conditions, which is a huge number. And then finally, healthy communities have better pedestrian safety outcomes. We found that 60% of our pedestrian deaths occur in locations with low or very low health opportunity, and that's related to the health opportunity index that I'm going to touch briefly on in just a moment. So a little bit more detail about each of those talking points. On the left-hand side of the screen, the portion of the pie chart in green are the number of fatal pedestrian crashes that happened at traffic signals. The rest of the pie is made up of other types of intersections or mid-block crashes. So almost 80% of our pedestrian deaths occur at intersections or mid-block locations that aren't signalized. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that almost 70% of the time, no crosswalk was available where we experienced a fatal pedestrian crash. And to get those numbers, we looked 500 feet in each direction where the crash occurred to see if there was a marked crosswalk available. And almost 70% of the time, none was available at these locations. And then fewer amounts of our pedestrian deaths occurred where we had a crosswalk available and the pedestrian was struck either in the crosswalk or outside of the crosswalk. Land use definitely matters. We saw that almost 80% of the time, our fatal pedestrian crashes occurred where we had pedestrian generating land uses along the roadway, the sides of the roadway, and almost 90% of our pedestrian injury crashes occurred at these locations. We also looked at our Virginia pedestrian crashes and the posted speed limits at the locations where the crashes happened, and determined that if you are struck as a pedestrian in Virginia on roads posted at 50 miles per hour or greater, you have a 7 times more likely chance that you're gonna die as a result of that crash. So 25 miles per hour or less, 7% of those pedestrian crashes result in death. And once you get to 50 miles per hour or greater, almost half of the crashes result in death of the pedestrian. Visibility is definitely crucial. Crosswalk markings and signs definitely play a role in this as well, but looking at light conditions, on the pie charts on the right, the yellow slice are the crashes that occurred during daylight periods, and the darker slices in the pie are the time periods where we had some amount of darkness or full darkness. Also on the left, you can see that in the late fall, early winter months of each year, we see more pedestrian deaths when we have fewer daylight hours when our pedestrians are out walking. And then number 5, our health opportunity index gives every census tract in the state a score of very low to high based on the opportunity to live a long and healthy life. And where we saw very low and low health opportunity index scores, it represents 40% of our census tracts, but 60% of our pedestrian deaths and injuries. So a little more about the Virginia Health Opportunity Index. It was developed back in 2012 as part of the Virginia Health Equity Report by our Department of Health. And it takes a number of indices that are available and uses those to develop a health opportunity index score that gives an indication of whether a person growing up in a particular census tract has the opportunity to live a long and healthy life. There are 4 different profiles that you can see in the middle of this screen in green: community environment, consumer opportunity, economic opportunity, and wellness disparity. Those get scores from the various indices that you can see in the orange box below. And then together, those scores make up the overall health opportunity index score. It's a pretty complicated model, as you can see the effects of the various indices on the profiles. But at the end of the analysis, what we're trying to do, as I mentioned earlier, is to try to predict the opportunity of an individual to live a long and healthy life based on where they live. One example of how this can show different effects is if you look at infant mortality rate on the left. Areas with a low health opportunity index score see higher infant mortality rates, and those numbers come down as you move through the quintiles up to a high health opportunity index score. Similarly, for low birth weight and low HOI areas, you have a higher percentage of births with low birth weights as compared to high health opportunity index areas. And as I mentioned earlier, the very low and low census tracts make up 40% of our overall census tracts in the state, but comprise 60% of our pedestrian deaths and injuries. So definitely some overrepresentation there. So when we learned about the HOI and began to use it for our pedestrian safety work, it was really eye-opening, and we saw a lot of connections. So using this information and the information from the crash assessment that I talked about earlier, we developed our Virginia Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. There are 3 major components of the plan. The first, we did a policy review of all VDOT policies and made recommendations to improve pedestrian safety. Second, we did a lot of safety crash data analysis to determine what locations in the state pose the greatest risk for pedestrians so that we can be proactive and try to improve the environment at those locations. And then third, the plan included a pedestrian safety countermeasure toolbox. Today I'm going to spend most of the rest of our time talking about the safety analysis that we used. The analysis includes a look at both crash clusters, which is a density map of where crashes involving pedestrians have happened in the past. And it also includes something we call pedestrian priority corridors. These are the lines in this graphic, and these corridors are areas where we expect the risk to pedestrians to be greater. This is more of a predictive analysis based on a variety of factors that we use to score each road segment in the state. When we first developed the PSAP back in 2018, this was our original priority corridor scoring factors. The high scores or portion of the scores were given to roads with the most traffic, higher posted speed limits, higher numbers of zero vehicle households, and greater amounts of population density. You can see in the medium category, segments were given credit for road geometry, whether it was urban, rural, employment density, and proximity to a school. And then low scores were given for the amount of population living below the poverty line, whether the location had a crash history with pedestrians, alcohol-involved crashes along those road segments, and proximity to a park. But after we learned about the Health Opportunity Index that I spoke about earlier, we worked with our consultant VHB to perform an analysis to determine the correlation between several of the factors that we were using to score and rank the priority corridors. And what was determined is that the Health Opportunity Index score had a very high correlation with where pedestrian crashes are occurring in the state, as did zero vehicle households. Employment density was more of a medium correlation, and population density was lower. And poverty density, surprisingly, was a very low correlation. So we ended up removing that from our analysis when we updated the plan in 2019. So in 2019, we updated our corridor scoring factors. In addition to the Health Opportunity Index, by 2019, we also had access to a statewide transit layer that we know also has a high connection to where our pedestrian crashes are occurring. So we included transit access as a high factor. Posted speed limit, we moved to the medium category. And then population density in urban rural context, we moved to the low category. And as I mentioned earlier, we removed the portion of the population living below the poverty line and the proportion of alcohol crashes in that area from the corridor analysis. And so if you're interested in learning more about the PSAP, you can visit this website and you can download a copy of the report by clicking this link that will come up when you navigate to the website. You can also download a copy of the pedestrian crash assessment, and then you can navigate through the map yourself and click on the corridors and see their attributes and see where the higher risk locations are in the state based on our analysis. And with any plan, we always try to have an implementation component, and we're very excited with our pedestrian safety action plan that we've had a lot of interest and enthusiasm about it already, and we've gained approval for several initiatives to install pedestrian safety infrastructure. In the fall of 2018, the first $8 million was approved for pedestrian crossing projects at 25 locations across Virginia. We funded shovel-ready projects, and most of those have been completed or are being completed as we speak. Then in 2019, we received additional approval for another $25 million in 8-SIP funding, and that $25 million is going to help us evaluate all of our VDOT traffic signals that are on the PSAP corridors and install crosswalk markings and pedestrian countdown signals at over 600 locations, with almost 400 of those being in our Northern Virginia district near DC. And then currently we're working on an exciting project with VHB where we're trying to figure out some new tools for the toolbox for our suburban arterials to help improve pedestrian safety. We're looking at some pilot projects at 5 to 10 locations on suburban arterials in Virginia. We used our PSAP corridors to screen those and are focusing on higher speed, higher traffic volume locations with 4 or more travel lanes. And we're also excited that we did receive a National Roadway Safety Award for Virginia's PSAP back in 2019. And this has helped us within the state to gain some credibility and interest in the plan, and also has helped us as we've sought various funding opportunities for projects. And so lastly, I wanted to leave you with just a few ideas for using data to develop a PSAP, if you're interested in doing that. First, your network of other safety professionals is invaluable. I say make friends and ask them what data they have and can share. And also ask your friends that you make to form multidisciplinary teams to guide your analysis decisions. And this doesn't just apply to pedestrian and bicycle safety work, but really to most of the work that we do as transportation professionals each day. We did have a stakeholder team that guided development of our PSAP. They provided invaluable input, helped us decide how to use those scoring factors for the priority corridors. And they've also been huge advocates to help us as we try to implement the projects with the funding that we've received. A good number of those initial 25 projects have been administered by our locality partners, and we couldn't do it without them. Second, GIS is a powerful tool for network analysis. In the case of our action plan, our consultant VHB helped us use GIS to assign weights based on the factors that we used and ranked our statewide network. So this was invaluable for evaluating all public roads in Virginia. And ArcGIS has provided a way for us to share this information with the general public in an interactive way and a transparent way. So the tool that I gave you the link for has really been a great way to share the PSAP. In addition, if you don't have the information that you need, you may be able to collect the data. We use Google Street View to collect data for our pedestrian crash assessment. It did cost a little bit of money, but it was very valuable information. And it wasn't outside the realm of what we pay for safety analysis work on other efforts. So well worth the cost. And then finally, I wanted to say, don't be afraid to try new things. This was the first time we had used weighted factors to score and rank the roads in our network. And I'm sure it won't be the last. It's really been a great new tool in our toolbox. In addition, this was the first time we used the spatial Bayesian analysis. And we have VHB, our consultant, to thank for that. And it's really been a great learning opportunity for us at VDOT. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time. Here's the link to the PSAP website again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Mark, and to Christy and Nick as well. We've got some time for questions now. I'll jump right into it. You spoke just at the end there, Mark, about data. And there's a lot of interest from some folks about specifically when you bring in all these data sources together for your analysis, a lot of questions about getting a statewide inventory of existing facilities, ped bike facilities in particular, that bringing that data into the analysis. It sounds like a lot of states may not have that at the ready. So I ask you first, Mark, and then circle back over to Christy and Nick about Oregon. But what was your process of getting that inventory of data together? Did you already have it? What might you recommend for states who are looking to build something like that?
Yes, Dan. So we didn't actually have our statewide inventory available when we first started the PSAP work. So what we did instead, so that we would have information that we needed for our analysis, is we used Google Street View to collect that information at all the locations where we had a pedestrian fatal crash, and a sample of the locations where we had pedestrian injury crashes. So that gave us a lot of what we needed to be able to do the work. And in the meantime, we've completed at VDOT an inventory of all of our sidewalk locations. So in the future, we hope to update the plan to include that information.
And how about in Oregon, Christy? Is that a data set you all already had? Did you have to develop anything new for your plan and your analysis?
We actually have quite a bit of data. We have in ODOT, we have a data tool called TransGIS, which is available externally to anybody that wants to take a look at it. And for any data set that we have in that tool, we keep a copy on our FTP site. So I went through and just took as many data sets as I could find and handed those over to Nick for state highways. And that gave him an opportunity to kind of sift through our data. Sometimes there are data sets that you want that are incorporated in bigger data sets. So it does take a little time to get familiar with the data that you already have because, you know, it may be buried. There are other data sets that we didn't have, and we're still thinking about how best to collect that data. So for example, lighting, we don't have a really good inventory of where lighting is on our state system, but we've been considering how best to look at current data. Is there a way that we can pull some of that information or give us insights into where that data exists based on just existing data?
Thank you for that. It's a good way to build on a next question I had, which was on sort of data that you didn't have but you would want. So that, Christy, you really answered that one. There are a lot of questions about that, sort of data sets that we may not have access to. Someone brought up some really good points about driveways as a risk factor, for example. And I don't know how many agencies have good, reliable data on presence of driveways, locations of driveways, and even within their crash data, knowing if a crash was driveway related. And so I was going to ask, maybe Mark, the same question. If you were doing your plan now and you could fold in another data set into your analysis, what kind of data would you want?
For a long time, we wanted the transit data. So getting the transit data, we didn't have that when we first developed the action plan, and we knew based on the other work we had done, there was a huge connection there. So getting that for us was a big win. Also, the Health Opportunity Index, that was has added a lot of value to our analysis. But I agree with you. I think any other data that can help paint the picture of the roadway environment would be helpful. And driveways are definitely near the top of that list because often that's where a lot of the crossing needs are that may not show up in the roadway inventory.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Mark. Christy, I had a question for you. Mark, I believe, mentioned something around the idea of just continuing after the plan has been developed. It sounds like building goodwill around the plan and getting it in front of people and reminding them that it's a useful resource. I had this idea spurred on by a couple of comments that came in during the stakeholder engagement phase of a plan development. You're really trying to get folks on board and participate. But then after the plan is developed, you're probably still having to do a bit of marketing of the plan and promoting its use and reminding people that it exists. And do you find that that's true in Oregon? And has the rollout of the plan been a big focus of your efforts since you kind of wrapped up the development of the plan itself?
Yeah, so we involved stakeholder meetings as we were developing both the head and the bike piece. And you're right, we did a great job of doing the go-arounds and rolling that out and getting comments and feedback. But now that we've posted it available, for viewing on our website, I think we do need to follow back with local jurisdictions to see how they're using it, or if they're using it, or if they need assistance. So that's something that we still need to do, is the follow-up piece. I don't think we've done a good job of that at this point, but I think that that's a really good point that we should consider that moving forward.
Thanks for that. And Mark, the same question back to you. I mean, you mentioned this a bit, but do you find that the rollout of the plan, have you had success in kind of getting support for it? Are there still struggles that you have in bringing everybody on board, I guess, with the plan and the implementation of it?
Yeah, so there's really been an overwhelming amount of interest in the plan, and I think anything related to pedestrian safety in the state, there's just so much interest that it's really kind of snowballed. Winning the safety award also helped. We've had a lot of integration with our long-range plan in Virginia called VTrans as well. I think one of the areas that's been the hardest for us is trying to implement some of the policy recommendations because you have to get down into really a lot of the details in the weeds, which is where you really change the future of the built environment and how it accommodates pedestrians. So we're working on a number of those policy recommendations as we speak, but that work has been very slow and just takes a lot more time than we would like. And that's because you have to do a lot of negotiating and consensus building. But we are making progress and we're determined to get through it.
Great. Thanks for that, Mark. We mentioned, we covered a little bit of information in our initial presentation about once the plan's developed, you're routinely going to be kind of looking at tracking your implementation and circling back, maybe you're reporting on progress every so often to see what's been accomplished and what still needs to be done. And Christy, I'm curious about from your perspective, and I apologize if you covered this and I missed it, for Oregon DOT, what does that process look like? How often are you kind of formally looking at your implementation of plan elements and keeping an eye on whether you're on track to meet your goals?
We try to do, we take a look at our systemic plans with the start of every arts round, which is about every 3 years. And then if we have funding, we'll focus on the plan that needs, the most update information added to it. Since we just published this plan, I don't think that we'll be doing an update or refreshing it until we, start the next round of arts, which is about 3 years away.
Mark, I had a question for you on, you mentioned a lot about kind of engaging with different jurisdictions around the state on the plan, and in particular to local agencies. I think a lot of folks on the webinar today are representing local agencies. Can you speak a bit about kind of moving forward with your adopted plan? How does VDOT kind of work collaboratively with a local agency to implement elements of the plan? Is it does it go through the typical project development process where you're kind of sitting down around the table, look at different corridors and things you have planned to do, or are there other ways that you kind of facilitate that coordination with local agencies around what's been recommended?
Yeah, sure. So we developed our pedestrian safety action plan as part of Virginia's Highway Safety Improvement Program, and we already have a means of constant communication with the local governments in Virginia. We divide our federal and state highway safety funding between local governments and VDOT roads, and we have a lot of outreach where we communicate what types of projects we hope to fund with those funds, and then help the localities have the tools they need to get those funds and deliver the projects. So we did have several members of our stakeholder team that were either city transportation engineers or planners, and so they've weighed in and helped to make sure that what we have is implementable at the local level. And so we'll be continuing to do more outreach as we go along and be funding more of these projects into the future.
Great. Thank you. I have one final question. I wanted to actually bring Nick and Alyssa in. I know both of y'all are in positions where you've been supporting some of the states that have developed plans and doing some of this data analysis. Nick, I'll start with you. That a lot of questions from state DOTs about these methods that we can be using to do more of this proactive systemic safety analysis, this risk-based analysis, and but states finding challenges in doing it. So data intensive, and some of the methods are pretty technical, I guess, and Mark mentioned some of those. So I wonder, from your perspective, how do you see kind of moving forward state agencies being able to do some of this risk analysis for and what data maybe advances are needed in kind of building data sets and making that available in order for agencies to be able to do some of this work?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think the biggest challenge I see is the basic infrastructure data understanding, maybe where you have sidewalks, where you have bike lanes, things like that. But there's really a menu of data analysis options out there where you can use just GIS analysis, joining up your crash data to your different geometric features, and doing a kind of a simple analysis to the more complicated Bayesian analysis that Mark was referencing. So there's really kind of a menu of options out there, I think, and so I wouldn't hesitate to start to kind of consider what data you have and what could you do with it, and then maybe look from there, like what could you do in the interim to get started with your analysis, and then what would you need to add on later to make it more robust. Like Christy said with ODOT, we've done this first analysis, and then maybe we'll build some data sets and we'll do another one. This was ODOT's second go at a systemic plan, and this time we had some more data compared to the last time.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. And Alyssa, I'll ask you as well. I know you did some of the work on Virginia's plan. Yeah, what would you say to that question?
Well, I mean, I think there's 2 points. One, I agree with what Nick said, is that, there's a wide range of what you can do, but I think it can be kind of overwhelming, especially if agencies are looking to kind of the perfect analysis that, has all the ideal data sets and how to get all that together in order to best do this, and I think really probably the best way to do it is to, do an assessment of what you have available to you right now, and to just get started. And then you can always build on that over time, come back and do the analysis again and add in those new data sets that maybe you were able to work with partners to compile, and then come back in 2 years and add that to it. And so I think kind of the, kind of chipping away at the available data sets to be able to do the analysis is really important. And I think it just doesn't have to be quite as overwhelming. So I think there's ways to just start to do it, and not to let the perfect get in the way of the good, and just begin. So I think that's probably the biggest kind of takeaway that I would use from that. And that, we know with the other kind of big opportunities that I see in terms of kind of data and sort of where agencies can look towards improving this, or challenges maybe also, you could think of it that way, is that we have really good roadway data for many state agencies and state roadways, but oftentimes not as robust roadway data sets for local roadways. And so just kind of, I think, thinking creatively about how you can work around that for now, and while still improving that in the future. And the other one is really thinking about pedestrian and bicycle volume data sets. We have so many great data sets for vehicular traffic, that non-motorized traffic, we need to start really prioritizing that data just as much as we do for motorized vehicles.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa, for that. I think that's a good place to leave it. We shouldn't let the data we have stop us, but an eye to those future methods and improving those over time. We've gone a bit over time. I apologize for that. I wanted to wrap up and just say thank you to our entire panel. You see them listed here on the screen. We've got contact information for everyone. Becky Crow at the Office of Safety, they're behind a lot of this work that's being done now. You can reach out to us if you have more questions. We're going to talk to some of your states tomorrow. We're holding an event just to really talk more about ped bike safety action plans at the state level and get some facilitated discussion going. So we hope you'll join us for that if you're signed up. If not, what we hope is that you'll be able to track down some of this information to really start the conversation about developing these plans for your own communities, for your own states, and kind of put in one place how we can solve this pedestrian and bicyclist safety problem and reverse these trends that we're seeing. So let me thank again the panel, thank all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.